Los Angeles, fall 2025. The CBS studio buzzed with tension, like the air before a storm. The scent of coffee, hairspray, and a faint metallic tang from technical equipment hung in the atmosphere. Behind the scenes, technicians tested microphones, camera operators adjusted lenses, and producers whispered nervously, glancing at their watches. This wasn't just another broadcast. It was the first joint interview in 20 years with Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, two legends whose names were synonymous with Hollywood's golden age. But beneath the glitz of fame, a simmering tension lingered, known only to a few insiders. America, in recent years, had been fractured. Political debates over free speech, cultural heritage, and media influence had ignited passions. For Americans aged 55 and older, who grew up on Pacino and De Niro's films, these issues hit close to home. They remembered a time when cinema felt purer, when actors were heroes, not studio puppets. Tonight's interview promised to be an event that would either unite or further divide the nation. The host was Elaine Crosby, a 62-year-old journalist with a reputation for asking tough questions. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and her navy suit exuded authority. She sat at the desk, reviewing her notes, as Pacino and De Niro entered the studio. Al Pacino, 85, looked like the embodiment of time. Deep wrinkles etched his face, but his eyes burned with the same fire as in Dog Day afternoon. His black sweater and jeans gave him a casual yet charismatic air. Robert De Niro, 82, was more reserved, a gray blazer, white shirt, and a faint smile that masked his tension. They greeted Elaine with curt nods, but didn't exchange a word with each other. It didn't go unnoticed. "Gentlemen, thank you for being here," Elaine began, gesturing for them to sit. "This is a historic moment. You haven't appeared together on air since Heat in '95. Why now?" Pacino leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "The time's right, Elaine. America's changed. We've changed. There are things worth talking about," he said, his voice low and gravelly, each word carrying weight. De Niro nodded, but his gaze drifted elsewhere. "People want the truth. And Al and we've always tried to show it," he said, his tone restrained. Elaine raised an eyebrow. She knew there was a long-standing rift between them. Rumors swirled that their friendship, forged in the '70s, had crumbled over disagreements about Hollywood, politics, and even their approaches to acting. But what exactly happened remained a mystery. Tonight, she intended to find out. "Let's start with something on the minds of many of your fans," Elaine said, her voice calm but piercing. "In recent years, Hollywood's been accused of becoming too woke, of losing touch with real people. You're both icons of the old school. What do you think of modern cinema?" The question hung in the air like cigar smoke. Pacino leaned forward, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "Look, Elaine, I'm not against change. But when movies stop being art and start being, what's the word? Propaganda? That's the problem. People can tell when they're being preached to. We made The Godfather to show human nature, not to lecture anyone." De Niro turned sharply toward Pacino, his eyes narrowing. "You serious, Al? You're calling it propaganda? What about what we did in the '70s? Taxi Driver wasn't just about human nature. It was about a society that ignores its veterans, its crazies. We were always saying something." Pacino smiled, but there was something predatory in it. "There's a difference between saying and shouting, Bobby. Today's movies shout, and people are tired of it." The studio atmosphere thickened, as if on the verge of an explosion. Technicians backstage exchanged glances. Elaine, sensing the tension, decided to pour fuel on the fire. "You're talking about different approaches to art, but let's be honest. Your views on America today differ too. Al, you've recently criticized media censorship. Robert, you've openly supported certain social movements. Can you find common ground?" De Niro leaned back, crossing his arms. "I support what I think is fair. But I'm not blind, Elaine. I see how people use these movements to score points. And that pisses me off. But, Al, he glanced at Pacino, you act like everything can be fixed by going back to the 70s. The world changed. Pacino stood abruptly, his voice booming like a Super Bowl halftime show. The world's changed, Bobby, but people haven't. They want truth, not lectures. And I'm here to give them that, even if it means saying something the crowd won't like. Elaine tried to steer the conversation back, but it was too late. De Niro stood too, his face flushed. You think you're the only one who knows the truth? I fought for this country, for its people, while you were shooting another gangster flick. Don't lecture me on how to talk to the people. The studio froze. A technician spilled coffee, oblivious to it dripping onto the floor. Elaine, maintaining her composure, said, Gentlemen, let's take a break. We'll be back after the commercial. The cameras cut off, but the tension lingered. Pacino walked to the window, staring at the Los Angeles lights. De Niro stood still, fists clenched. Backstage, a producer whispered into a walkie-talkie, This is either the biggest hit or a disaster. When the broadcast resumed, Elaine shifted tactics. She knew she couldn't let the interview spiral into chaos, but she also understood that this tension was ratings gold. Let's talk about your friendship, she said, her voice softer but deliberate. You've both said your collaboration on Heat was defining. What happened between you after that? Why did you stop talking? Pacino returned to the desk, his face calmer, but his eyes betraying pain. Life, Elaine. Life got in the way. We both did what we believed in. Sometimes that pulls people apart. De Niro nodded, his voice quieter. We never fought. We just went different ways. But I always respected Al even when I disagreed. Elaine sensed a moment of truth. She leaned forward. So what would you say to each other now, if this were your last conversation? Pacino looked at De Niro, and something like regret flashed in his eyes. I'd say you were the best partner, Bobby. And I'm sorry we didn't talk more. De Niro sighed, his shoulders slumping. I'd say the same, Al, but we're not done. Not quite. Elaine smiled, feeling the interview could still become legendary. But she knew more surprises lay ahead. And when she asked her next question, no one, not her, not Pacino, not De Niro, was prepared for what would happen next. The CBS studio pulsed with tension, like a heart about to strike. The cameras rolled again after the commercial break, and the air carried the scent of ozone from overheated spotlights, mingled with a faint trace of Elaine Crosby's perfume. She sat behind the glass desk, her notes neatly stacked, but her eyes keenly tracked Al Pacino and Robert De Niro. Both actors had returned to their seats, but their postures betrayed unease. Pacino tapped his fingers nervously on the armrest, while De Niro sat rigidly, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. Elaine knew she was walking a tightrope. The earlier exchange of sharp words between the two legends had already gone viral on social media. X was ablaze, with headlines like Pacino versus De Niro. Heat in real life. But she didn't want the interview to devolve into a petty squabble. Her goal was to uncover what lay beneath their tension and give Americans, especially the older generation who grew up on their films, something more than just a spectacle. Gentlemen, Elaine began, voice calm but laced. We've just touched on your friendship, your differences. But let's go deeper. America is divided right now, politics, even what we consider truth. You're both voices of a generation. How do you see your role in this divide? Pacino sighed, his gaze growing heavier. He ran a hand through his hair, as if gathering his thoughts. Elaine, I'm not a politician. I'm an actor. But I see how people are losing the ability to listen to each other. In the 70s, we made films that made people think. Serpico was about corruption, but also about a man standing by his principles. Today you get canceled for saying something wrong. I don't want my words censored, but I also don't want to shout into the void. De Niro nodded, but his face remained impassive. AL's right about one thing: people don't listen. But I think we, as actors, have a responsibility. We don't just entertain. We show the world as it is. And if I see injustice, whether it's racism or economic inequality, I can't stay silent. The problem is, people want simple answers, and there aren't any. Elaine sensed an opportunity to sharpen the conversation. Robert, you mentioned injustice. But many, especially your older fans, feel that modern movements for justice sometimes cross a line, becoming intolerant of other views. Al, you seem to share that sentiment. Can you agree on where that line is? The question struck like lightning. Pacino leaned forward, his eyes flashing. The line is where hypocrisy begins, Elaine. I've seen people destroyed in the media for just speaking their mind. That's not justice, that's revenge. I grew up in the Bronx. I know what struggle is. But I also know you can't fight hate by creating new hate. De Niro turned to him sharply, his voice cutting. You're calling it revenge? What about people who've had no voice for decades? You think they should just wait until the world gets kinder? Al, you live in your world where everyone can just talk. But in the real world, people suffer. Pacino slammed his fist on the table, not hard, but enough for the sound to echo through the microphones. I'm not saying they should wait, Bobby. I'm saying yelling and blaming doesn't change hearts. You want to change the world? Set an example. Talk to people, don't preach. The studio froze. Technicians backstage exchanged glances, the producer holding his breath. Elaine, however, remained composed, her eyes gleaming with excitement. You both talk about dialogue, but there seems to be a lack of it between you, she said, her voice soft but sharp as a blade. Let's try an experiment. Imagine you're not in a studio, but in a diner, just the two of you. What would you say to each other to bridge this gap? Pacino sighed and leaned back. His face softened, but his eyes still burned. Bobby, I respect you. Always have. But sometimes you think your truth is the only one. I want us to talk again, like we used to, without this barrier. De Niro was silent for a long moment, his fingers gripping the armrest. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet, almost vulnerable. Al, I don't want to be your enemy. But I see the world falling apart, and I can't just sit back. You think I'm shouting? Maybe I am. But I'm shouting because I care. The moment was like a breath of fresh air after a storm. Elaine sensed they were on the verge of something real, but she knew she couldn't stop now. She decided to go all in. All right, gentlemen, let's talk about what might hurt the most. There are rumors that your falling out wasn't about politics or Hollywood, but something personal. Something that happened after Heat. Are you ready to reveal the truth? The question hung like a bell before a fight. Pacino froze, his eyes narrowing. De Niro's lips tightened, his face paling. Backstage, a camera operator whispered, "Wow, she went there." Pacino spoke first, his voice low, almost a whisper. Elaine, some things are better left in the past. Bobby and I, we had our demons. But we're here, aren't we? That's something. De Niro nodded, but his eyes betrayed pain. Some wounds don't heal, Elaine. But we're not enemies. Never were. Elaine sensed they were dodging the answer, but she also knew pushing them now would ruin everything. She shifted topics, but her mind was already planning how to circle back later. Okay, let's talk about your legacy. You've both created films that defined a generation. But if you could leave America with one idea, one thought, what would it be? Pacino smiled, his smile genuine for the first time that evening. Listen to each other. Don't yell, don't blame. Just listen. That's the magic. De Niro nodded, his voice soft. Be real. Don't be afraid to stand for what you believe, but do it with respect. Elaine felt this was a moment of unity, but she knew the interview wasn't over. She had one final question, meant to be a bombshell. One last question, gentlemen. Imagine you could make one more film together. What would it be about, and how would it reflect America today? Pacino laughed, his laugh raspy but warm. It'd be a film about two old friends trying to figure out what happened to their country. They'd argue, fight, but in the end, they'd find common ground. Because that's what we need. De Niro nodded, his eyes gleaming. I agree, but I'd add one scene. They're standing on a street in the middle of protests, and they just talk to people. Not as heroes, but as regular guys. Elaine smiled, feeling the interview had reached its peak. But as she opened her mouth to wrap up the broadcast, something unexpected happened. A man stood up from the audience, his face tense. "Gentlemen, I'm a Vietnam vet," he said, his voice trembling. "Your films gave me hope when I came home. But today, I see my grandkids living in a world where no one listens to each other. What can I do to change that?" The studio fell silent. Pacino and De Niro exchanged a look, and in their eyes was something new, understanding. Pacino stood and walked to the man, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Listen to your grandkids. Tell them your story. Show them you love them. That's the start." De Niro followed, his voice quiet but strong. "And don't be afraid to be vulnerable. That's not weakness. That's strength." Elaine felt her breath catch. This was a moment that would go down in history. She closed the broadcast, but she knew this was just the beginning. America was watching, and America had changed, if only for a moment. But backstage, as the cameras shut off, Pacino and De Niro stood in silence. Their eyes met, and in that quiet, there was more than all the words spoken that evening. What would happen next? Could they overcome their differences? Would this interview be the start of a new chapter, or the final act of their friendship? The CBS studio slowly quieted. The spotlights hummed, radiating heat, and the air still carried the scent of coffee and tension. The cameras were off, and Elaine Crosby, removing her microphone, exhaled as if shedding a burden. She knew she'd just been part of history. But for Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, the moment of truth was still unfolding. They stood backstage, in the shadows, where neither producers nor technicians could see them. A silence hung between them, thick as Los Angeles smog, but laced with something intangible, possibility. America was still buzzing from the broadcast. X was flooded with posts spreading like wildfire. Pacino and De Niro tore the studio apart. It was like a scene from Heat, but real. They gave us hope. For Americans over 55, who grew up on The Godfather and Taxi Driver. This interview was more than a show, it touched their hearts, reminding them of a time when conversations mattered, and heroes were real. But what did it mean for the actors themselves? Elaine approached them, her heels clicking on the polished floor. She stopped, holding a tablet with the first reactions to the broadcast. "Gentlemen, you just did something incredible," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "People are saying this was the most honest moment on TV in years. But I want to know, how do you feel?" Pacino looked at her, his eyes tired but burning with the same fire as in his youth. "Elaine, I don't know what I feel," he said, his voice raspy. "But I know we said what we had to say. And maybe that'll change something." De Niro nodded, his face calmer than before. "We showed who we are. That's all I wanted." Elaine smiled, but her gaze lingered on them both. "You're not done with each other, are you?" She didn't wait for an answer and walked away, leaving them alone. Pacino turned to De Niro, his hands in his pockets, as if hiding his nervousness. "Bobby, we haven't talked like this." "How long?" 20 years. His voice trembled, but it was filled with sincerity. De Niro sighed, his shoulders slumping. He looked older than he had in the studio, but a spark flickered in his eyes. 22, Al, and I didn't think we'd ever be in the same room again." Pacino took a step closer, his voice quieter. "I don't want this to be our last word. We fought over stupid things, views, pride. But you're my brother. Always have been." De Niro was silent for a long time, his gaze wandering the walls, avoiding Pacino's eyes. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. You remember how we sat in that diner in New York after shooting Godfather 2? We talked about everything, life, art, how to change the world. I thought we'd always be like that. Pacino smiled, his eyes glinting with memories. We drank terrible coffee, and you complained it was worse than gasoline. De Niro laughed, short, but genuine. It was the first real laugh of the evening. It was, he said. Then his face grew serious. Al, I don't agree with you on a lot of things. But I don't want to lose you again. They stood there for a few seconds, as if afraid to break the moment. Finally, Pacino extended his hand. Then let's start over. No yelling, no blaming. Just two old friends trying to make sense of this crazy world. De Niro looked at his hand, then, instead of shaking it, pulled Pacino into a hug. It was awkward, restrained in a masculine way, but in that gesture was everything: forgiveness, hope, understanding. Deal, De Niro said quietly. Backstage, a technician who overheard the conversation wiped a tear and whispered to a colleague, "This is better than any movie." The next day, Los Angeles woke to a media frenzy. The interview video racked up millions of views, and the moment with the Vietnam veteran went viral. But what struck people most wasn't that Pacino and De Niro argued. It was how they found common ground, not through compromise, but through honesty. For Americans over 55, who'd seen their country fracture, it was like a breath of fresh air. They posted on X, "If these two could do it, maybe we can too. This reminded me why I love America." A week later, Pacino and De Niro met at a small cafe in Santa Monica, far from cameras and spotlights. They sat at a table by the window, listening to the sound of the ocean and the chatter of passers-by. The coffee was better than in the 70s, but the conversation was just as real. They talked about everything: old films, new challenges, how to pass their experience to younger generations. They didn't agree on everything, but they didn't need to. Their friendship, like America, was imperfect, but alive. The final frame of their story wasn't grandiose. There were no premieres, no awards. But in that cafe, amid the scent of salty air and freshly ground coffee, two old friends took the first step toward reconciliation. And perhaps it's these steps, quiet, unnoticed, but real, that can change the world. America watched and felt. If Pacino and De Niro could do it, maybe there was hope for everyone.